And like I said, this is a open discussion. I'm by no means an expert in auto guiding. I'm a student of astrophotography, just like everybody else. So a lot of everything that I've have here or we'll talk about tonight will come from some of my own experience, but then a lot of it actually comes from the PhD website. So Thomas, are you recording?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I tried to, auto guiding is such a huge topic, and honestly, this could easily be two discussions. I tried to keep it focused on, a little bit for people that are on the more beginner side or doesn't even maybe know what auto guiding is. Get a little bit into the details on how to auto guide, talk about, setting up for auto guiding, all the equipment that's involved. We're going to do a deep dive into PhD 2. And then at the end, I'll go through what I just am calling tips, best practices, and myths. There's a lot of myths to some of the things with auto guiding that people have, and I tried to I'll try to highlight some of those. So first, before we get too deep, what is guiding, period? I know most of us already know this, but I wanted to just, for completeness, at least, tackle this. So, this is my own definition in my own words: the constant monitoring and correction of a star's position by nudging the mount to keep the position of the guide star precisely on track. You can see the image on the right-hand side is an example of a long exposure of when somebody wasn't guiding, and because of the inherent mechanical errors in the mounts that we use, the guiding isn't always going to be perfect. There's also lots of other reasons why we want to use auto guiding. In fact, this was actually surprising to me. I guess it never really dawned on me, but it makes sense that guiding used to be done manually. With the slow motion controls, people would literally sit there, and Paul Borchert told the story of this when he was in Hawaii, that he literally sat there for a half an hour with his eye into the eyepiece or secondary eyepiece and manually using the slow motion controls to auto guide while his camera captured photons. Fortunately, we don't have to do that anymore. And we have motorized mounts, cameras, and computers that help us, all do that. And so that's auto guiding, is that same process, but automated. And the auto guiding cycle, this is, we'll talk about this throughout this whole presentation, but essentially what you need to understand is we're going to lock onto a star. When we're trying to image, you're going to lock onto a single star, and then we're going to watch that star. We're going to take a picture of it. We're going to remember where it is. And then every moment thereafter, every image that we take thereafter, we're going to measure the next pictures where that star is at, measure the error to where the first one was, and then we're going to issue a correction to the mount and to tell it to go back to where it should. And we're doing that depending on the mount. It could be as often as every second. And so that's the cycle, and that just repeats and repeats and repeats and keeps the telescope pointing precisely at the same patch of sky as the Earth rotates, and it gives us good looking images. So why do we need to do this? I already hit on some of this. Auto guiding is used for long exposures and helps correct those tracking errors. Some of those are periodic error, just the mount mechanical imperfections. Maybe your polar alignment's not perfect, and just in general, just tracking errors. But generally speaking, it's beneficial for exposures greater than 30 to 60 seconds, I would say. Maybe longer. If you have a higher end mount, certainly higher end mounts can easily do 30 to 60 seconds without auto guiding. But I would say the majority of the population has lower end mounts, consumer end mounts, and would require auto guiding if they're trying to do anything longer than a minute potentially. You know, some of these high quality precision mounts, depending on, you know, your polar alignment, the type of mount, and your setup, and make sure you've done all the other types of things that you're supposed to do. I've heard of people getting as long as 10 minutes or even more with unguided imaging, and that, you know, obviously would be the goal one day, if you can afford that type of equipment. And
Says food is ready, ma.
hi, Grish.
Oh, hey guys, sorry. Didn't realize I wasn't on mute.
Yeah, no problem. So the you know, until we get to that point, you know, where we can do without auto guiding, you know, that's what tonight is all about. But there is advancing technology, and it just continues to seek out minimizing or even eliminating the need for auto guiding. And then even today, there's things that are going on. I know Astrophysics continues to post performance on their Mach 2 mount by use of modeling, which is a pretty quick thing, and they're getting 5 and 10 minute images without having to auto guide. So it's pretty exciting that they're able to do that. But nevertheless, one of the things that I wanted to make a point of is that, you know, we start out in imaging, and you really don't need a lot. You need a camera. You don't even need a telescope per se, but you need some sort of lens. And you may not even need, you know, something to track the Earth's rotation if your exposure is short enough. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that when you do want to start taking longer and longer exposures at longer and longer focal lengths, the ability to do so becomes very, very expensive, and it's not just a small step up into that, having to be ability to do that. It's actually quite a big leap, and I'll show you that in a couple slides here. But this was a graphic that I tried to convey. It's not exactly correct, but you know, as you go increasing your larger focal lengths to a narrow field of view, you need to your likelihood of needing to auto guide becomes higher and more difficult. And then obviously entry level mounts are almost certain needing to be auto guided, and as you step up, the need goes down. Just to further
I'll go into my room, Nana. It's easier, bigger screen.
Hi, Vijay.
Oh, hi.
Can you go on mute, please?
Yes.
Thank
Sorry.
you. No problem. Welcome. So just to drive that point home a little bit further, I took this example, this comparison is that if you wanted to image, which we just did the other night with I think William, you're on, right? You just need a DSLR, and we had on B-Scope, which has a motorized mount, and that was it. That was enough. We did use the computer, but we didn't have to, and we were able to take quite a few good images of the dumbbell nebula. But if you wanted to, and that was, I think we took 30-second exposures, and it was reasonable. But if you wanted to take, you know, 5-minute exposures on F-Scope, you could still use your DSLR. You could still have a motorized mount, but now you need a guide camera of some sort. You need a guide scope, whether that be the main scope or a on-axis telescope that runs parallel to the main scope. Of course, if it's off-axis, you need an off-axis guider adapter. You have to worry about focusing now the guide camera. You have to have a guide star, period. Not always is there a guide star there, depending on the focal length that you're operating at. You need guiding software now, such as PhD2, a laptop or PC or some other computer to process or analyze the guide star locations. It just adds more cables. You now have to use ASCOM or something similar to get all the equipment to talk to each other. And of course, you need more power, or you will be consuming more power. The benefit, of course, is that you can get 10-minute or more perfect exposures, unlimited objects. You're not limited to the objects that you can image, at least from a tracking perspective. And depending on as long as everything else is operating well, you have nearly zero fallout, as opposed to B-scope. It's limited to, certainly, I think, less than 60 seconds, maybe a little bit more if you're lucky, depending on where you're pointing in the sky. But it's also limited to fairly bright objects only, just because of the short exposures. So it has its limitations, even though it's a great scope. There's two methods that are most commonly used for auto guiding, and it's called on-axis guiding, which you see the image illustrated there on the left, where you have a separate telescope that runs in parallel, points to the same area of the sky, and it has its own camera. And the other side, on the right-hand side, is called off-axis guiding, where you take advantage of the telescope that you have, but they have this little adapter here where there's a tiny prism where it picks off just a little bit of the light cone that's coming into the telescope and reflects it upward. You can see the yellow line here, reflects it upward to a second camera. And I won't go into, there's a big debate on whether one is better than the other. I personally prefer off-axis guiding. It just, if you're going to already make this leap, I think it's worth it. You can see the advantages that I have listed there. It leverages the existing scope, so you don't have to have a secondary scope. It's, I would argue that it's lower weight. While it is a little bit more complex to set up, I think it's just a one-time deal. And if you don't take it apart, or you don't disrupt this setting, you don't have to do that each time. And the real benefit is that there's no flexure or alignment to the main scope. It's already using the main scope, so there is no concern there. Some of the disadvantages, obviously, is there's potentially fewer guide stars. You're using the outermost part of the light cone, and just a small piece of that. So it's possible that there's fewer guide stars to choose from. I think in generally it probably is more costly, and it is more work to change over when you want to change your setup to something else. You have to tear that all apart. Whereas if it's just another telescope riding piggyback, you may not have to disturb that at all. I think the other thing is it doesn't look as cool, right? A lot of these people have big scopes on even bigger scopes, and that looks impressive to people. But if you're going for that kind of thing. The last point here I just wanted to make about the complexity of auto guiding, and not to scare anybody away, but just to make it known that it is involved quite a bit more than just regular imaging. This is a schematic version of that image that I showed before. This is right now we're in process of trying to get our 10-inch Meade scope at the observatory to be auto guiding capable. Russ and I were out there earlier this week, and we hooked it up, and it's auto guiding well. But before we had put all that equipment on her, this was essentially the setup. You had the telescope mount, the 10-inch Meade, you hook your camera up to it, and you're ready to go, and you just start taking pictures. Whereas now, to get it auto guiding and be able to control from the control room, I have added the guide scope. So we're doing on-axis guiding, the guide camera. This Icron Ranger is not absolutely necessary, but it is if you want to control it from the control room. So over a longer distance, this could easily be just a USB hub. Or if you have enough USB ports on your computer, you can plug directly into it. but in our case, we have the Icon Ranger so that we can go over long distance, and then that eventually goes into the computer or laptop that you're using. Interfaces with ASCOM, which is a software that runs in the background on your computer. You won't interface with it directly ever, and you won't even know that it's running. You'll only know when it's not running, because you'll start to have issues. But it goes through that, and that's really the middleman, the traffic controller. It directs all the messages that come in and talk to the various pieces of software that you may or may not have running. In this case, we have PHD2, which is controlling the auto guiding. Backyard EOS we're using to control the DSLR camera. And then this is not a must-have, but it's a nice-to-have, is we're using CDC, which is planetarium software. So if I just flash between those two, we went from this to now this. But again, the reward is we were getting 5-minute guided images on the 10-inch Meade now. And it's a Celestron CGEM DX mount, which is, you know, an affordable mount for, you know, like $2,000. So I wanted to start jumping into auto guiding a little bit deeper, but before we can do that, I wanted to make sure that we had some fundamentals covered and some of the key terms, because you're going to start hearing me use them later. I mentioned this cycle that you see pictured here, where we take a picture, we measure the star position error, we make a correction, and then we repeat that cycle. Well, in order to do that, when we first take a picture, we take a look at where that guide star is and we record its position. We call that the lock position. And then every picture thereafter is measured relative to that position. So in this case, the guide star is now moved over a little bit. They calculate the center of that star, and then they measure the distance away it is from the lock position, and then issues a command to the mount to go back to that lock position. The green box that you see here is called the search region. So that's just the box that the auto guiding software is going to search within to find your star and calculate what the center of that star is. Usually you don't have to adjust that or change that, but you can make the search region larger or smaller depending on your situation. Some of the other, I won't go into dithering now because I have a slide on it later, and dither position. So I think that's the terms there. The other thing that I need to talk just briefly about is backlash, because it's a term that you'll hear me use later on. And I wanted to make sure that everybody understood exactly what backlash is. A lot of the mounts that we use, not all of them, but a lot of them are gear driven mounts. And those gears, no matter how high end you, how high end a mount you have, there is going to be some amount of play between the gear teeth. And that's what's being shown here. Now, the higher end mounts are certainly going to be a lot better and really minimize this, which is why they're worth what they cost. But essentially, backlash is the amount of play between the gears. And why this is important, or why this matters, is that you may not see the mount actually move, or when the auto guide software issues a command for the mount to, you know, correct itself, you may not see it move right away. And it's one of the reasons might be because you're in this dead zone where it issued a command for the gear to turn this way, but it was so small that it didn't yet contact that tooth yet to actually turn the scope. And so to combat that, some mounts on the actual mount. Now I'm not talking about the software, the guide software. This is either in the mount itself or in the software that controls the mount. Some of them have what's called backlash compensation, and that's to help overcome this dead zone. It would advance through that, knowing that we don't want to be in that dead zone ever. For the sake of auto guiding, mount backlash compensation should always be turned off, because you don't want it fighting or doing differently than what the auto guiding software is trying to tell it to do. It's going to fight it. It's going to say, go, move the mount for 100 milliseconds, and it'll move it for a little bit more than that because it's trying to overcome backlash. And the guider will then, oh, you went too far, and then the guider will, send a signal to undercorrect, and you'll have this constant back and forth. This graph here that you see is a plot of the declination error, where the center line is 0. So a perfect guiding scope in the declination axis would be just a straight line all the way across. And you can see that it's a little bit under the line here. It comes through, and then it stays up here, and it's hanging up here, and it's not correcting. It's not moving itself down. These little lines that you see here are what we call guide pulses. And you can see that the software is trying to say, get back down, get back down, get back down, and it's not doing that. And one of the reasons, this is a very, stereotypical curve that you would expect to see when a mount has excessive or considerable backlash. And so this is, I guarantee you, is if you get into auto guiding, you're going to exhibit this or observe this. And we'll talk about how we can overcome this, or at least minimize it. Some other things that you need to understand before we get too far or much deeper into this is the other types of things that auto guiding can correct for. And what you see here on this chart is the red line represents the declination axis, and it's tracking error relative to a perfect guiding scope, or rather not guiding, tracking. So the guiding is actually turned off. So no guiding corrections are being made on this chart. And you can see that the declination is got this overall, just this steady drift away from where it should be. Again, that should be just perfectly straight across. Similarly, the purple or blue line that you see is the right ascension axis, and it too has an overall drift away from what would be ideal, but it also exhibits this up and down wave pattern that is known as periodic error. And so these are the things that auto guiding can help correct for, is this drift that you see in the declination and right ascension axis, as well as this periodic error. Now there's other things. There's a thing called PEC, or periodic error correction, that people often have in their mounts. That has nothing to do with auto guiding. That's also a technique to get rid of this wave-like tracking that your right ascension axis has. But even if you have a PEC curve loaded into your mount and it makes this essentially straight, there is still going to be ever so slight residual periodic error, and the auto guiding can then correct for that. And so for those two, those three things really, the drift in the deck, the drift in the RA, and then the periodic error of the RA, those are things that auto guiding can help us correct for. The last thing that I wanted to point out on this slide was you see on each of them, there's these tiny fluctuations as it goes on, up and down, these little zigzags. That is most likely a result of the seeing conditions. So as we take an image of a star, we have the atmosphere that we're looking through, our great Wisconsin skies to image through. The star is going to be bouncing around, because we're measuring at very, very small scales. And these little tiny bumps around here is likely a result of seeing, and that is something that Autoguiding cannot correct for. And in fact, I think I talk about it later. There is a parameter in your AutoGuide settings that is called a minimum move, and you want to make sure that your minimum move, or the minimum error that would cause the AutoGuiding software to want to make a move, is above the seeing conditions. Because otherwise, if it's too small and it says, oh, nope, it's off, make a correction. Oh, now it's off again, make a correction. You're going to be constantly making these little corrections when maybe you didn't need to, because it's not actually even showing up in your main image. And it's called chasing the seeing. It's something that we don't want to do, and ultimately cannot correct for in anyways. It's unpredictable. All right, so hopefully that was enough information to make you dangerous. If you don't know much about Autoguiding, now you have a little bit of background. You have a few key terms that you understand. Are there anybody have any questions so far, at least on what we've covered? I must be doing a really good job. All right, well, we'll keep going then. So there are, there's a bunch of different auto guiding software out there. These are the three that I have experience with. I don't know if anybody else has other examples of guiding software that are out there. The two on the right, Maxim DL and Sky 10, are paid programs. The good thing about them is that they have their auto guiding capabilities within the software. And so these are used for many things, but they are the image capturing software, they are the auto guiding software, and in some cases you can use them for minor image analysis and so forth. But I think by far, and likely because it's free and it works really, really well, the most common program that you're going to see out there people using is called PhD2. And that's what we're going to go in depth on here in the next few slides. The PhD stands for Push Here Dummy, and that's really, if you watch any YouTube videos of the people that maintain this software and really what it was when it first came out, or when they started going out, that's really what they wanted to do is make sure, or try to take as much of the complexity of auto guiding out of the picture. And it literally is, if you just take their default settings and follow it, the setup correctly, it works really good just out of the box. This is a screenshot of a typical setup of PhD. These windows, obviously, you can move them around or split them up, but this is how I typically have my windows set up. The upper left-hand corner here is where your guide camera image will be. So every time you take a picture, it'll show up here. This obviously is our lock position, the search region with our star that we're locked onto. Over on the right-hand side is just a zoomed up view of that guide star, so you can see just a visual representation of that star. And then here is a profile of the star to show you whether or not that star is, how well it's focused. Make sure that it's not saturated, which is something that you want to avoid. If it were saturated, you would see this curve come up and it would have a flat top and then come back down. You want to make sure that you have a nice peak in your star profile there. And then the other things worth pointing out here is these visual representations of the error of your guide star over time. Here is a bullseye target. ideally you would like to see exactly what's shown here, is where you have a very tight cluster of points collecting on the bullseye itself. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes the scatter is a lot wider than that, depending on the quality of your mount and the tracking area you have, and or the precision of it. Maybe it could be off. I've had that too, where it's actually guiding well, but it's not guiding from where it was originally supposed to. And there might be reasons why it's doing that. We'll talk about dithering here a few slides from now. The other representation here is it essentially gives you the same information, but it represents it in a better way to show error over time, and it shows when it issued corrections to the mount. And so this is actually a really good curve that you're seeing here. We're zoomed out quite far. This is plus or minus 6 arc seconds. Usually I'm not tracking at that scale. I'm usually zoomed into plus or minus 2. So this graph you see the ups and downs a lot more clear. But nevertheless, you can see that it made corrections in the right ascension with the little blue here. And virtually, I don't see a single correction that was made in the deck axis. And ideally, that's what you have, right? The deck doesn't move or shouldn't move if you have perfect alignment with the Earth's rotation. Only the right ascension actually rotates. Some of the other things are just the buttons to control the software. This first button is what you'll press to open up the equipment dialog. When you want to connect your equipment, you click that and a box will open up where you can connect your equipment. It's also where you can set up your equipment, and I'll go through that in a second. To start taking images, you press this looping button, and that'll just start taking images one after the other. The duration between those images and the duration, the exposure time of the images is set here. Obviously, when you want to stop, you hit the stop button. If you don't see the stars in your image, you may have to do a screen stretch to some extent, and which is what this slider is for. And then under this little brain symbol is the advanced settings. Definitely you can go in there, but like I said, it's not absolutely necessary. If you follow the equipment setup wizard, usually the default settings work quite well. In the while you are auto guiding, if you start to see performance and you know what you're doing, they do have these settings right here on the screen, so that you don't have to go into menus, and you can tweak the guide parameters right there on the fly. If you don't know what you're doing, or if you're new to auto guiding, I would suggest or recommend that you don't touch those, at least without first making sure that you have some of the other fundamentals set up correctly, like a good polar alignment, that your mount is balanced well, that there's no stiction in the mount, all these other things, no cables dragging, all these other things that can influence guiding.
Jeff, can I ask a question? I don't know if it's appropriate to jump in or
yeah. What's up?
Back on the previous guide parameter controls. Those things, I've had cases, instances where I'm not getting enough correction, or it doesn't seem to be. What does this stand for on the guide parameter controls? These two on the right, and I found that I've had to increase that number. Some people say up to 5,000 or whatever, just to get the mount the corrections that you need.
Yeah, so the ones on the right, I believe, are the maximum move. If anybody wants to chime in there, I know for these other ones, these are the minimum move. That I briefly mentioned.
Yeah.
Right. You want to make sure the minimum move is not too small.
Okay.
But like you're saying, there's two things that I would that comes to mind when you say you don't have enough correction, or it's not correcting fast enough. One, One could be maybe the maximum move is set too low, and that kind of
Right.
correlates to what
Right.
you're mentioning. You're increasing the number, but also the aggressiveness, right? Even though you have, let's say you had the right ascension maximum move be 2,500 milliseconds, the aggressiveness is only at 70. And I think the way you interpret that, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's only really going to do 70% of this number, because it's trying to smooth that over time.
Yeah, and it does seem, I don't have a peer. I have a tripod, and so my polar alignment gets off, and so I have to increase these numbers somewhat to cheat a little bit.
Yeah.
Get a bit more action out of it. But okay, thank you. I just wondered what that actually did there. All right.
I'll cover here in a slide here or two that's coming up is the guiding assistant. I don't know if you've ever run that, but that might be something you want to try, because after it measures, well, let me get into that, and you'll see why. But it might be it might help you with your settings here. That's why I personally have only when I was first starting out, which I shouldn't have, is when I touch these. I very rarely touch these ever. I always let PhD, because I think it knows better than I do on what the best settings are for my mount, my performance, and the current scene conditions.
I guess what I settled in at is that there's no reason why you just shouldn't kick these numbers up really high, and they'll work,
If it works, if it
too
got
low, they may not. So, and it didn't hurt anything otherwise. All righty.
well, and that's honestly that's what matters, right? If it suddenly started performing the way you wanted, and your images are turning out good, then there's no right or wrong.
So Jeff,
Everything for me is trial and error. Sorry.
Hey Jeff, I just opened up PhD 2. How do you turn on these? I don't see a setting for turning these on the fly buttons on.
Are they grayed out right now, Dennis?
Well, I'm not connected. Do they only come up when you're connected?
I was just going to suggest that I first thing I would try is connecting, and then maybe they become active.
Okay. All right.
Or it might even be they become active when you hit start auto guiding.
Yeah, because I have actually this is the first time I've actually seen these, and I was guiding last night.
Yeah.
And these were not. I used this graph, but these buttons were not there.
The other thing you might try is if you have this graph smushed down too far, it's possible that the software hides those. So if you were to make that guide window a little bit taller, possibly they would appear.
Yeah, no, I've got it like from the top of my monitor to the bottom. So yeah.
All right. Well,
I'll play with that. I thought there was maybe a view button that turn those controls on.
There certainly is. I mean, check the view menu at the top and make sure that which ones you have turned on and off. Just experiment with that.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, Dennis, did you make the comment about something being set at 250 or whatever? And I thought you were referring to this. And I'm thinking, well, if that's the case, that's really low. But I'm not sure.
Yeah. No. That was I forget. That was something that the auto number was set that Jeff was talking about.
Yep.
I think you'll get to that.
In fact, I think next slide, actually.
Oh, okay.
Well, not directly, but it's in this. So it's on, and I can show you. I have PhD pulled up, but then once you open up PhD and you want to start setting up your equipment, there is a new profile wizard, which is highly recommended that you use because looks like this window that you see in the upper right hand, and it walks you through setting up your equipment. It first asks you what kind of camera do you have, and what they've done now, they didn't used to be like this, but I would say pretty much every single popular camera on the market is now in that pull down. which is great because now you don't have to go look up, oh, what's my pixel size, or what's my array. It's already preloaded in there. They've done that work for you now. If it's not in there, you can still type it in, but then which is no big deal. If it's connected, if you have it connected and you hit the detect button, it'll likely populate the pixel size automatically for you. That seems to work really well for me in my experience now since they've added that. What you still have to manually type in, because it can't detect what your focal length is the guide scope focal length, and make sure you're entering the guide scope focal length, not your main scope, unless your main scope is your guide scope. That's a key distinction there. Once you've entered your camera information, the next question that it asks you is about your telescope mount. So, because it's going to need to communicate with your mount so that it can issue commands to correct it. And so it's essentially asking you for what is your telescope driver. You specify that. And I think I don't have it up in front of me, but I think it asks for adaptive optics, which I have zero experience with. I don't know what is in that menu. I always hit just next. And I think the last thing is this build dark library window that pops up, which it'll then build a dark library for your guide camera, which is helpful because when you take images with your guide camera, some of the stars that we're trying to guide on are very faint. And if you dark subtract the frame, it makes them more prevalent and easier to see. And I think it also probably improves PhD's ability to determine the centroid, is my guess. The default for the building of a dark library, that's only something that you have to do only the very first time. After you've built that library, the next time that you connect or next time you set up, as long as it recognizes that same camera, you won't have to do this. It'll remember and use that. I think by default, the exposure times that it runs through is 1 to 6 seconds. I don't, just because I'm impatient and I don't want to wait for it to take 5 images at 1 second, 5 images at 1.5 seconds, 5 images at 2 seconds. By building that library, I usually go up to 3 seconds and leave it at that. And then the number of frames, I just leave it at the default of 5 frames. And once you've gone through that, you've now essentially established this profile, this equipment setup, and you can give it a name and save it so that when you connect next time, you can just pull up that profile and save having to enter all this information in each and every time. I just wanted to make sure I hit your one question, Dennis. So I think that was under the brain, if I recall. Uh-oh. Now I just have a frozen screen. All right, I'm going to go back to my presentation. I'll figure that out. So now that you've set up your equipment, set up a profile, it's connected. The first thing before you can auto guide is you have to calibrate the PhD. You have to basically tell it about the camera orientation of your guide camera, and you also have to teach it how far does the telescope move when it issues a correction, a command to correct. And the commands that it issues to correct the mount when it says move up, move down, move left, move right, we call those guide pulses. And a guide pulse is measured in milliseconds. So you might have a 20 millisecond pulse that is issued to the mount. It will move the motors for that period of time, and then PhD will sit there and wait for it, feedback to say, yes, I just made that move. and it'll take another image and and repeat that process. But how does, you know, PhD needs to know whether it, you know, the correction needs to be up, down, left, right, with your right ascension and declination axis. So you have to teach it that. And that's what calibration essentially is doing. And calibration, it turns off the, or not turns off, it's not guiding, but it's issuing pulses in just the deck axis. And it watches and it tracks how the star moves, and it's measuring the displacement of that star and the vector, the direction of that star in the orientation that it moves. And then it brings it back to center, and then it does the same thing for the right ascension, and it moves the right ascension in one direction, and it watches and tracks that star, and then it brings it back. And once it's done that, and a good calibration will look like what you have seen on the screen here. It's not really important, the orientation, whether this is perfectly, you know, on the axis or not. What's important is that this is orthogonal or perpendicular to each other. That's the perfect ideal calibration and ideal or perfect mount performance. You'll see that I think I have some examples. Actually, I don't have any examples of this per se, but this is a very perfect curve. I don't know that I've ever seen this perfect myself, but I don't have a super high end mount either. But in general, you'll see these dots will be bouncing around this trend line a little bit, but it'll still perform very well.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hey, Steve, I remembered your question. And it does the wizard set the calibration step size? That's where we really differed. You know, Jeff, yours was at like 250, and mine was at like 650.
Right.
And so did the wizard set that, or did you manually set the step size? How do you determine those steps in the calibration?
So right now, unfortunately, I have PhD is locked up on me, and I wish I could. Maybe it'll here. Okay, now it's responding. I wanted to go in there. So as part of that wizard is when it asks you for the camera, right? It asks for the pixel size.
Okay.
But that's essentially what it's asking for, is what's your pixel size on your guide camera. And then it also says, what is your telescope focal length?
Right.
And with those two parameters, it knows the image scale of your guide scope in arc seconds per pixel.
Okay.
But as far as the calibration step size goes, to help influence those parameters, there's this advanced menu that can help you calculate what is an ideal step size for your setup. And when you click, I hope you guys can see this. I can't make it any bigger. I know my resolution is usually really small, but hopefully you can see this.
Mm-hmm.
You specify the focal length of your guide scope, the pixel size, whether or not you're binning 1 by 1 or 2 by 2 or whatever, the guide speed of the telescope that you want, the number of calibration steps, and when you plug all this in, given the scale, it will spit out an answer for you. I always just accept whatever it gives me, because I know it's smarter than I am. And when you hit OK, it will automatically load it here for you, given your settings.
Okay.
And so that's step size. I don't believe. That's a good question. I'd have to try it again. I don't know if that is part of the equipment wizard or if it just happens in the background. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly something you can do it after the fact. You can go in this little brain, click the brain, and then go to the guiding tab. This is also, while I'm here, this is also where you can set the, where is it? The window size. Am I missing it? search region here. So that little green box that I mentioned for the search region, if that's too small, or if it's just barely fitting the star in, or the star just barely fits inside that search window, you can increase this. This is in pixels. So this is just drawing, and in my case, a 15 by 15 square box around the star. And if that's not adequate, you can pop in here and just boost it up a little bit. It'll make it a bigger star, or bigger box rather. All right.
Okay.
If I could ask a
Yeah.
question, probably pretty obvious answer, but I don't know it. And sometimes it takes more steps to get to that limit than other times. Why is that specifically? And I always figured, well, it depends where you are, your scope is positioned, this and that. What specifically is it?
If I think I understand your question, sometimes you'll see it issuing commands to correct, and it just won't correct. It's just
no. What I'm saying is, when you're doing your calibration, it does a step and then it shows how much movement. And let's say you need to get to 25.
Oh.
But sometimes it takes.
Yeah.
Every step is that much smaller, so it takes more steps. Other times it just seems to get there very quickly. What's going on there?
I think where you're pointing in the sky has a lot to do with it, is my guess.
I assume
which you know, I remember this when we were Thomas, Agnes, and I would try to calibrate G-scope, which is super long focal length, and we would do it towards the North Pole, or the what do you call it? Celestial pole. Yeah. It would take forever, and I would kick myself for trying to do that, because the pulses, it doesn't move it very much, and it needs enough information to draw a trend line. Whereas the recommendation you'll see here in a second, or I didn't mention it yet, is when possible. It may not always be possible. That's why it's not absolutely necessary. But whenever it is possible, always perform your calibration near the meridian and at deck equals 0, which is what this telescope, this orientation, that's why I put this picture here, shows. That's the approximate location where it's best to do and the reason why they do that is because that's the area, this region of the sky where the stars are moving the fastest.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
One other thing, I'll mention these other key points here. The other thing that I wanted to just show, and actually this is a myth that I talk about later, is hopefully you can see this graphic here. The XY that you see is the XY coordinates of your guide camera, the pixels on your guide chip. And the other coordinate system that you see here is the actual movement of the declination and right ascension axis. So the guide software may tell the mount to move 100 milliseconds in the right ascension direction, and what it's going to do is it's going to make this diagonally line down or up depending which way it went. The point here is that those two coordinate systems do not have to be perfectly aligned. That's what you're teaching PhD when you do your calibration. It's figuring out the relationship between those two coordinate systems so that it can do the math for you in the background. One thing that I'll mention later on in the tips is that this orientation, while it doesn't have to be aligned, if you do take the time as best as possible to align them so that XY is deck RA or vice versa, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to diagnose problems, because you're isolating deck in the up down axis, and you're isolating right ascension in the left right axis, and so that when you are seeing problems, you know whether it's the right ascension that's the troublemaker or the declination that's the troublemaker. For mounts with deck backlash, this is just a suggestion or recommendation. I hadn't done this before, and in fact, I'm excited to go out and try it now, to see if it gets me even just a little bit better performance. But it's so intuitive. Is you should bump your mount, your deck axis in the north direction, just manually before you begin a calibration. That ensures that you've cleared the backlash. And it seems so fundamental, and I don't know why I haven't been doing this.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say those 2 points, like point 2 and 3,
Yep.
they make pretty dramatic improvements in your guiding.
Yeah. Absolutely. I agree. And I'm the first person who I don't do this myself because I'm usually in a rush and I'm lazy, and I just do my calibration where I'm pointing in the sky. But to your point, if I'm in the north hemisphere or whatever, I'll take the time to.
Yeah, they make such a big difference that I,
Yep.
as a habit, do it. So,
Yep. It's worth it, right?
So Arun, Jeff, are you saying then that when you change targets, you don't have to recalibrate?
no, you do not have to recalibrate when you change targets.
That's correct.
Interesting. Okay.
And I'll take that one step further. I think I mentioned later on that for those of us that have permanent observatories, you don't even need to do a calibration again. You can restore it from the previous night, provided nothing has changed. That's the power of this, this software and equipment, that you may only have to do it once in every month, or maybe even less than that. I think you could probably get away with it. I was watching some stuff in preparation for this from on the PhD 2 website, and it even recommends that you don't need to do your calibration, even if you do set up and tear down your rig every single session, because what they were suggesting is just use a piece of tape or whatever, and a pencil line to mark the orientation of your guide camera relative to the scope, and that's good enough. I personally, because running this calibration takes, if you're doing it in the right area of the sky, it takes less than 2 minutes to do, and I'm not that impatient that I can't wait for that.
So I guess the way to think about it is anything that changes the orientation of the deck and RA axis with respect to the XY axis
Yep.
of your guide camera will require you to redo a calibration.
Yep.
Right.
And that particularly for those of us that are doing off-axis guiding, that means if you have a rotator,
Yep.
you have to redo your calibration,
Yep.
and you change that rotator. This is just a helpful tip. Sometimes they can appear or come across as nag messages, or they're really trying to help you. When PhD will often give you little alerts that pop up. The advice is don't ignore them. Don't just click on the X and ignore them. Read them, and at least if you do read them and then close them out, at least you knew that was an issue or a concern, rather than fighting all night long to try and figure out why your performance is not there, and all along this warning could have popped up. So that's their methodology, or their mindset is it's better to know that you are possibly opening yourself up for error than not to know. And then we already mentioned this. So anytime you do an equipment change, you change in the mount. Oh, that's another thing. If you change the mount guide speed settings, or like Arun mentioned, the rotation of the guide camera, all those are reasons you would need to redo your calibration, because you've now changed that relationship between these two coordinate systems. Steve, I mentioned the guiding assistant. So once you have a calibration and you want to fine tune or perfect your guiding, or just maybe you want to understand how your mount is performing, and or try to get a feel for the current scene conditions, there's a wizard or tool in PhD once you're guiding that you can go and run. It's called the guiding assistant. And what it does is it measures the current scene conditions, it measures the behavior of your mount and your guiding subsystem, and then it also checks for polar alignment error. And it only takes, it doesn't take a ton of time. The longer you run it, the better, because you get a better representation of the behavior. But 2 to 4 minutes at least is what's recommended. And the cool thing about this guiding assistant is you don't really need to know all the information or really even understand it, honestly. But the cool thing is that once it measures that performance, it'll give you recommendations on those parameters that we talked about and what is optimal not only for your equipment, but for what's optimal for your equipment that night for those scene conditions. And so once I learned about this, again, it takes a little bit of time, but I think it's worth it that I typically run this every time I set up, if anything, just to get a feel for the scene conditions. But then, just to fine tune, because again, I trust the software. It works very well. And I guarantee you it knows more or better than I.
Hey, Jeff. Have you tried this auto backlash compensation?
So I was just going to talk about that. I have not personally used it. The only thing I've ever done is I've measured it.
Okay.
And my backlash has not been bad enough that it has made a recommendation to use it.
Okay.
So, but I did see, and I think, so what you see on the screen here is an example of where this guiding assistant, after it measured it, it actually said, hey, you may want to try starting with a backlash compensation of this. I've never had it so bad where it made a recommendation yet. So that's probably why I've never used it.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else has.
Yeah, I have, and it really made my guiding worse.
Jeff, it depends upon the mount. So I have two. With the Los Mandy, I do need to apply deck backlash compensation.
Mm-hmm.
And I generally set it to auto. And it, I think, settles around about 1,000 milliseconds. With my Mach 1, there's no backlash compensation needed.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. With the Paramount, I've never had any issue. And then I tried this, and my God, the guiding went to hell.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably you don't need it. And the other point on declination backlash is the reason why this is a checkbox on the guiding assistant is because you only need to do it once. When you're first setting up your rig and you want to understand how your this brand new telescope or new mount that you have is performing, you would want to measure your declination backlash and see if PhD has any recommendations for applying compensation. But once you've done that, it's not going to change from night to night, session to session, unless you damage your mount or do something significant to it. So for that reason, you don't need to do that. Otherwise, if you have that checked, it makes this whole process go a little bit longer, and it's not necessary. The other point for both of these, for both calibration and the guiding assistant, those can be done as it's getting dark. When you can just barely start to see stars is when I do it. So I have to sit around waiting for it to get dark anyways. It's still too bright to actually begin imaging. So there's really no reason, unless you're not arriving at that time to set up, or you're not, there's no reason why you shouldn't do the guiding assistant. I think it can only help. If anything, just to see what it is. You can choose whether or not to apply the recommendations. All right, dithering, how are we doing on time? All right, so we're just about an hour. So dithering is a technique that we use essentially to make post-processing more friendly or easier on us. There is, almost every camera that we have or that we use has some sort of hot pixels or some sort of pattern noise in them that we don't want and we want to process out. And dithering is one way of helping that process of removing them, removing that noise from your final images out. What dithering is essentially we take, remember I mentioned we had a lock position, that first position of where that star is, or where we want to auto guide it back to if it deviates from there. What we do is after we've taken our first image, we now actually auto guide to something offset from that lock position. And it's intentional. We want to do that because we want to move the location of our signal, whether it be stars, nebula, our galaxy, whatever it might be. We want to move the signal such that it falls on different pixels of your main camera. And when you do that, you'll see, if you were to blink all your images, you'd see your stars and your galaxy, if you will, bounce around just a little bit. But that's okay, because in the post-processing, we're going to align all that back so that they're right on top of each other. And what the result is that the noise, the background that we want to make smooth and get corrected and fixed for hot pixels, that'll be statistically eliminated out when we go to stack and align our images. And so dithering, this is one thing that I couldn't get a straight answer, and maybe somebody else knows here, who is really driving the bus on the dithering. What I was able to figure out is that the imaging app, so the app that you're using to capture your main camera images, that'll control or signal to PhD when to dither, because obviously it'll you want to dither in between images. And from my understanding, PhD actually controls how much based on the dither mode that you choose. The other where it got a little confusing is I think the imaging app has a maximum setting saying, don't dither more than X amount. And how much you need to dither really depends on your setup, your camera, how many pixel defects it might have, and also the relationship between the main and guide camera image scale. You may have to dither 3 pixels on your guide camera in order for it to move 1 pixel on your main camera, for example. And so how much you need to dither will depend on that ratio between those image scales.
Hey, Jeff.
Yep.
Can you back up a couple bullets here? You say that the imaging app controls when.
Right.
Well, in SkyX, you turn on dithering, but then you also tell it how much to dither.
Right.
So you wouldn't use then PhD2 as well, right?
No, in your case, you're using auto guiding that is inside the imaging app, right? I'm speaking.
I use PhD2, but I dither from the imaging app side.
Okay, and so that's where it gets confusing. It's not really, honestly, it's not even really important how it really happens. It was just interesting to me to figure out who's really driving the bus.
Right.
Whoever does it, I guess it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But
I mean, do you get a double?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, because I have dithering shut off on PhD2.
Okay.
Because I turn it on SkyX and tell it to dither 2 or 3 pixels.
That's probably good that you have just one.
Yeah, so I always was confused about that because I didn't know whether they would fight against each other or what,
Yep.
what would happen if you had both of them on.
Yep.
Does PhD2 require the app to tell when?
Well, so the reason why PhD, you may want to use PhD dithering, because I'm not as familiar with dithering in Sky 10, but the reason why you may want to use dithering in PhD is because they have different dither modes. For your situation, because you have a nice high-end mount that performs really well, maybe it wouldn't benefit you so much. But for somebody who has, considerable backlash, you may choose, and I kind of skipped over this, the different dither modes that they have. One is just a random, where it literally is just gonna, go over here, now go over here. It's gonna literally be random, and you'll have deck reversals, which are maybe not good if you have a lot of deck backlash. But they also have spiral, which is just gonna march that new point around in a square, increasing the size, which is a little bit, it still accomplishes the same thing. It scatters our signal across different pixels, but it does it in a little bit more routine way, such that you're not constantly going back into that backlash dead zone.
But PhD2 still needs to know when to dither, right?
Right.
So somehow you've got to get that information from your acquisition software. It has to be capable of talking to PhD2.
I'm sure Sky 10 in their dithering algorithm issues a command to say move the mount.
So, for instance, in SGP does talk to PhD through a PhD port.
Right.
And it is the imaging app. PhD cannot know when to dither simply because PhD doesn't know when you are in between images. So it has to be the imaging app that tells PhD when to dither.
Right.
Question is, is PhD determining how much to dither, or is SGP or some other app determining when to dither? And I think that part is unclear.
Yep. If anybody figures it out, that'd be great. It's kind of one of those things that's nice to know, but as long as it works.
Right.
Right.
I assume the answer is no to this question, but does that affect the dithering affect your graph history in PhD2 or your error?
It will. If you just briefly though, you see how in this example, each time they're dithering, there's a big spike, and then it brings it back. Right. So that big spike was measuring relative to the old position.
Yeah.
But then it immediately corrected because it said, wait a minute, I just dithered. I want to now guide on this location.
There's a huge amount of time between the dither spikes there. And actually, it's less than that, isn't it?
I don't know the time scale between these marks, but in practice, you will see it make a move and then immediately correct to that new location. So you will visibly see it in your graph, but as long as it brings it back to center line, that's what's important.
Yeah.
Right. I see those same spikes, even though, like I said, I have PhD2 dithering turned off.
Yeah.
But I see exactly those same spikes.
But Jeff, as you say, though, those spikes, smaller spikes are seeing conditions. And
yep.
Let's assume, I don't know if dithering affects those smaller spikes.
No.
Okay.
Dithering,
the larger ones.
Yeah, again, dithering.
Huge amount of movement here. That's just what I'm having trouble dealing with at this point. And it's between, the time between is significant. Whereas dither, sometimes it might ask you every so many frames or something.
It depends on what you have set up. Like I dither in between every single image. That's just what I choose. You don't have to.
Yeah. And then you choose an aggressiveness level too. Is that right? I mean,
yeah. In
SGP, it'll ask you,
small, medium, large, right?
Yeah, or something like that.
Yep. And I wouldn't read too much into the magnitude. I know this looks huge, but you're talking arc seconds here. And most of us operate at a, like a 1 arc second pixel scale. That's only 3 or 4 pixels that it moved.
So Jeff, I don't know if you're going to cover this, but you're not actually, recording the image when you're dithering, right? And in a software like SGP, you can tell it how much time you want to wait for it to settle before you restart imaging.
Oh yeah.
And yeah. And as long as you say, okay, settle for less than X number of pixels for, let's say, 5 seconds, then it'll have no impact on your images because it's waiting for that oscillation to settle down before it starts imaging again.
Yeah, excellent point. That's another reason not to be too concerned with those spikes, because it will settle down depending on what you've specified.
Yeah,
That settle period only occurs when you're initially beginning to start the image, and then if you and then it'll only run through that settle period again until you go outside your established parameters as to what's acceptable or not. Is that not right?
No, so you have to separate dithering from normal guiding, right? Okay. So when you're dithering, you're making a deliberate movement to your scope to move the guide star, right? And then you wait for that oscillation to settle down, and then you're basically guiding your star at the new position, right? Okay. Yeah. So what you're saying is, I want my guide star to move from, let's say, X1, Y1 to X2, Y2, right? Yes. And wait till it settles at that position before I start guiding my normal way again and start imaging. So that's what's going on.
Where do I see that settle period? Where is it? I don't recall seeing that anywhere.
You should be able to set that. You should be able to set that in your acquisition software, right?
Yeah. Is that, let's say, SGP? Is that right in the AutoGuides settings for?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I
the AutoGuide
never paid attention to it.
Yeah, definitely look in the AutoGuide settings. It'll say settle for X number of seconds, or actually it'll say settle for X number of pixels for a period of time. And I usually do settle for 1 pixel, plus or minus 1 pixel for 5 seconds, I think is what I have mine on.
Yep, that's what I use as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
The last point here, and unless somebody has it, I've never thought of a reason why you wouldn't dither. I don't know why you wouldn't dither.
I don't know why I think this is happening, but I've compared one to the other, and I've found just visually the image is sharper. Now that doesn't make any sense. I know, but maybe it's after I've combined the images or whatever.
Yeah.
But I see a level of sharpness that appears to be lost when I dither. Yeah. But I have things I need to. I'm learning here, and I have things I need to watch for, and one is the noise level. Yep. The big eye, right?
That's a huge. By the way, the dithering is a huge advantage for DSLRs, just because it has so much pattern noise in those sensors and cameras, because they're not cooled, right? Or at least not out of the box, they're not cooled, and so they really benefit from dithering.
It's not so much the cooling, Jeff. It's just the quality of the sensor. So that's what you have in DSLRs.
Okay. All right. Good question. So I've used this log troubleshooter once or twice myself, but I did want to point it out, at least for completeness here, is this Andy Glasso is just another everyday user who took the time to create this PhD log troubleshooter, and it's separate software that you have to go out and download. But what it allows you to do is upload your log that PhD generates, and it makes it into a very nice user-friendly visual representation of your data. And you can, it's just far easier to use this log troubleshooter to visualize your tracking, your guiding performance when you have issues. So if you don't remember this this link, it's if you just go to the PhD2 website and click under news, it's there as one of the added tools that you can use to just further analyze the performance of your mouth, particularly when you're having issues. I personally have not had a lot of experience with it. I saw that it can do this frequency analysis and so forth. So I think you can get pretty in depth if you really like that kind of thing and are really trying to get to truly optimize guiding. All right. So we haven't really talked about, we've talked about ideal guiding and when everything goes rosy, which is not usually the case often. So I think what follows here for the rest of the presentation is, how can we improve performance and what are some best practices and tips and some myths. The first thing and first advice for anything you're doing when you're trying to troubleshoot or improve your guiding performance is to be very systematic and methodical when you're doing it. Don't change too many things at one time because you won't know which one actually helped or which one is hurting. So it is, honestly, I actually don't do this because I've had experience where if you just follow what it tells you and take its recommendations, it's worked very well for me. But nevertheless, if you do have some issues where you're needing to troubleshoot, be very systematic on what you change, and then experiment only on a night where the seeing is good. That, here in Wisconsin, that's hard to do, but because we've got to cherish every clear night we have. But do your testing high in the sky. You don't want to have atmospheric influencing your guiding performance. Obviously, the seeing is worse at the horizon than it is at the zenith. So just to take that out of the equation, try to do any of your testing high in the sky and let it settle before you draw any conclusions or act on what it's telling you. You want to make sure that you're not just making decisions or changing parameters based on some of the randomness that happens, and you're waiting long enough for it to actually show a trend on how the guiding may have changed, either good or bad, based on what parameter you changed. And again, just to drive the point home is when you're making changes, make single small adjustments. This is a very delicate balance to getting good performance, and that it usually never takes large adjustments to fix your problem. It's always really subtle, minor changes. So I mentioned backlash and what it is and why it's important. There is in that declination backlash measurement that I mentioned in the guiding assistant. When you do perform it, there is a button that you can click that says, show me the graph. And on an ideal backlash measurement, this is what you would hope to see, where it allows the declination to move up in one direction, and then it starts issuing pulse commands in the opposite direction. And if you had zero backlash, it would follow this white line that you see here. It would immediately turn around, go the opposite direction with no lag. But usually inherent in most geared mounts, there is going to be some amount of backlash. This horizontal portion may be longer than what you see here for lower end mounts, but that's the backlash is what you see here, where it's got this flat top for, in this case, it was, three pulses until it finally started now turning around and going back down. Now, this is common. This is not just because it didn't, immediately turn around. That's not bad. It just means you have some backlash, and there's many ways that we can account for that or deal with that. If you do this test and you start to see some, weird performance, like what's happening here in this graph, it didn't even, it has backlash, which is kind of this flat top, but then even after that, it was struggling to turn around and bring it back down in a nice uniform and linear way. This could be a result of many different issues, but two of the most common are a weight imbalance. Maybe you don't have your mount balanced as well as it could be, or if there's just a lot of stiction, so friction in the declination axis, which a lot of the lower end mounts are very stiff, and they're actually very difficult to get a really good balance because the manufacturers of those mounts usually just torque the nuts down way too tight, or they have far too much grease in the mount. And if it's cold outside, all that induces stiffness in your system, which is never good. So just something to be aware of, that if you're trying to you're doing that backlash, this is perfectly normal and ideal, even though it's not on the precisely on the ideal line there. For what, some things that we can do to battle backlash is, one, use that actually the first thing you can do is just try to use a higher mount rate setting. When you do that equipment setup, it asks you what guide speed would you like to guide at, and I think the default is 0.5x of sidereal. If you have a minor amount of backlash, you may get away with just bumping that up a little bit or even to 1, and that would be enough to overcome your backlash. If you have a little bit worse backlash and that's not quite cutting it, a second option is to try to use backlash compensation. And for really bad backlash, you may just try to do guide pulses in only one direction. And the thought there is that, let's say you have drift in your declination axis, you kind of let it drift through the center line, and then once it gets too far on the downside, you issue a command to correct up, and then you let it drift again until it gets to that point. And so you're only really issuing guide pulses in one direction, and that also will help combat backlash that you might have. For really horrible backlash, just go buy a new mount, which sometimes may happen.
The backlash only goes one direction. Does that change when you do a meridian flip to where you need to have slight polar misalignment in the other direction to accommodate that? Or is that
that's a good
for?
I would think that it's smart enough to know when it needs to do in the opposite direction. That's a good question. I'd have to think that through, because now it'd be drifting the opposite, right?
Yeah.
I know I have done on some mounts, I've had to do unidirectional, and I know after a flip I didn't worry about it. I didn't think about it, or I didn't have any issues. So I have to think that PhD is smart enough to know that it reverses.
And the other thing is setting the guide speed to be more than half. That's really only relevant for the RA backlash. Is that
okay? Yeah, I think, yes, you're right.
Okay.
Yep, good point.
Right. Okay.
So other common problems that you might run into, and these are very common. I've learned, the hard way to make sure that we've accounted for these. If you go to the observatory, all of the scopes that are set up for permanent in permanent observatories, we've done, Thomas and I will spend 2 hours, 3 hours routing cables just so that we know for sure that we will never have issues with cable snagging. If you are using, a on-axis guide scope, it's possible that over time, the winter comes, the summer comes, your rings that hold your guide scope could loosen or cause the guide scope to move. So if you suddenly have a jump, it's possible that the guide scope itself physically moved, and it might be a result of a loose mounting ring. It could be wind gusts. That's always a problem. If you're not in a dome, that's always a concern. If it's too windy, that your telescope will just be getting pushed around like a sail and cause your jumps in your guiding. The other thing that's also common is just unstable ground or vibrations in the ground. And this is really common if you're setting up out on your deck on your backyard. That's not a stable ground. It's probably perfectly okay as long as you're not imaging and walking around out there. But just realize that if you're walking around or if there's other things that are shaking the ground that your mount is set on, that could definitely influence your guiding performance. And then I put in there earthquakes. And then in our case in Z2, we do have ghosts. So we were fighting a ghost, and I think he's still there, but we're winning right now. We just got a really, really expensive and well-performing mount, and it seems to combat ghosts really well. Thomas and Agnes know what I'm talking about. Tips and best practices. The first thing that you need to keep yourself level set on is remembering what PhD2 can and cannot correct for. And really what it can correct for is the slow and steady errors. Those can be tracking errors in the mount, any uncorrected periodic error. If you're using PEC and it's not absolutely perfect, it can correct for whatever's the remaining periodic error that's there. Any drift due to polar alignment error, and also atmospheric refraction, which I had to look this up, is apparently stars appear to move more slowly as they are near the horizon. This is something that I hadn't thought about. I have to think that this is rather subtle, but it can correct for this. What it can't is that high frequency stuff. So we talked about the seeing poorly behaved hardware. So if your hardware is just misbehaving, obviously it can't, it's unpredictable and it can't correct for that. Anything sudden shifts and deflections, like we just talked about, vibration, differential flexure. I didn't mention this too much, but with the on-axis guiding setup, where you have a separate scope that is parallel to your main scope, if those move relative to each other, that's called differential flexure, and obviously PhD cannot correct for that. And then similarly, if you have large backlash issues or field rotation, it cannot correct for those types of things. So having said that, the rest of these tips, assuming that we're talking about the things that you can correct for, you can, and many people do, and even I get caught up in it, pixel peeping and really trying to get absolutely excellent guiding performance. What it boils down to, though, is don't get caught up in the graphs too much. Go look at your main camera image and see if you can even see the error that you're seeing in the guiding performance. It's very possible that your guiding camera can see issues or tracking errors, but your main camera can't even see it. It's not even showing up in your images. And so at the end of the day, let that be your judge on whether or not you need to make any corrections or if it truly is a problem. If it's not, don't worry about it and don't fix it. Definitely use the PhD2 equipment setup wizard that I mentioned. I would say 99, probably 99.9% of the time, the default settings are going to be perfectly fine for you. From a mount capacity standpoint, this one, I mentioned imbalance and overloading is another concern that you may want to keep in the back of your mind if you're putting a telescope and your guide camera and your guide scope and your main camera, and you're hanging all this equipment off your telescope, or your mount, and you're at or even more than capacity, you probably should have pretty low expectations on how well you're going to guide, particularly if you are using some of the low to mid-range mounts like Celestron, Iotron, those. It's not to knock those mounts, because I own a Celestron myself and it performs very well. But I think the CGEM DX mount that I have claims that it can handle 50 pounds. I don't exceed 30 pounds on mine setup, because I know if I try to push it much more than that, it's just not going to perform like I want. Now, for the higher end mounts like Paramount and Astrophysics and those other higher cost mounts, those are fully capable of performing at their capacity. I haven't seen one yet where it couldn't perform equally as well at the capacity. So those are, you can trust and really take up to the maximum capacity, which is probably one more reason why they cost what they cost. I didn't mention this because I'm pretty sure that this is a thing of the past. I don't know if anybody does or knows anybody who still uses ST4 cable to do their guiding. But I thought I'd keep it in here just for completeness, is that another way you can communicate with your mount is through a separate cable from your guide camera directly to your mount. And everything that I mentioned up to this point has been using or taking advantage of the ASCOM's platform that runs in the background, and using the computer to run through ASCOM and talk to the mount. But you can still do it today, and the guide cameras come with it, is the option to run it through a cable. The reason why ASCOM is preferred is it eliminates the need to have that cable. So one less cable, that's great. But also these ST4 cables, and they're not that great. They can get old and crack over time. And I think, when they were being used, that was the norm for the longest time, that those were the number one source of communication issues, is that you had a bad connector or a broken wire or whatever it might have been. So for that reason, stick with ASCOM as your method of communicating guide pulses, and just do away with the SU4 cable.
Hey Jeff, this is a curiosity question.
Yeah.
How does ST4 even work? I mean, you have all these algorithms and all of this that we look at in PhD2, and ST4 is just a direct connection between the guide camera and the mount.
The guide,
yeah.
as I understand it, so you actually have to change the guide pulse parameter, depending on the software, to be I can't remember what the other name is, but from my understanding, the camera itself has some circuitry to be able to issue that command to the mount.
Okay.
I can't tell you, because I did it when it first came out, or when I first started, but I quickly moved to ASCOM.
Yeah. Okay.
But there are some sort of relays in the camera that that help drive that pulse.
Isn't it just like an old telephone wire that sends an analog signal, sort of similar to how when you press move north on your hand paddle?
Oh, okay.
It's just sending that signal for that amount of time that it thinks it should send the signal for. And
are they mechanical relays in there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just assuming that what is being sent is just an analog voltage, and then that's just like when you push the button on your hand paddle. That's what I used when I started in imaging as well.
Yep. One other thing, if you are getting, if maybe it's a not a great night for imaging, but you still want to try to capture some photons, one thing to help avoid chasing the seeing is to increase your guide image exposure. So rather than take guide images every 1 second, maybe is what you're used to doing, then maybe double that. Take one every 2 or every 3 seconds. But you have to balance that with the mount that you have. If your mount can't guide for 3 seconds accurately, then maybe you're going to have to compromise and do, split the difference. But that will help smooth out some of the seeing conditions if it's a less than average seeing night.
Can we talk about exposure a little bit and the amount of time between exposures? I've heard different things from people who know, and I'm wondering what amongst the group here, what the consensus of opinion is. Every 7 seconds, of course it depends on the length of your exposure too, or every 1 second on the other end of it, it could depend on your scope and focal ratio and all that junk. But
Yeah.
I'm curious as to what people think.
From my perspective, I have 2 mounts, one that has very low periodic error, Mach 1 that has very low periodic error. The other one has very high periodic error, Rainbow Astro 135. And the RST 135 has such high periodic error that I need to issue guide pulses every half second. So I take a half-second exposure and then make an adjustment. The trick with that mount, though, is that it has very, very low, almost vanishingly small backlash. So it immediately responds to that. So I would say one of the biggest drivers for your image, well, there are a couple of things. One is the sensitivity of your camera. You got to get your exposures up to the right amount so that you can get a good star to lock onto. The other one is that if you have very high periodic error, you have to figure out that you can't, do an exposure on a star for 10 seconds when your periodic error is very high. In the extreme case of the RST, it's about 1 second. That the periodic error is so large that over 1 second, you would expect the star to drift more than what your images would tolerate. So you issue those commands. So those are 2 things that I can think of that would kind of guide what your duration should be.
And I think
the other one is seeing.
You hit on it too, is focal length, I think, plays into that as well, right? If you're at a really wide field, short focal length, it's going to be a little bit more forgiving, right?
Yeah, it'll depend on your sampling, but I mean, almost all mounts that are not like corrector encoded or have a model in place are about 7 arc seconds or more.
Yeah.
And even if you have a wide field, you're going to see 7 arc second trailing in your image.
I don't know, and I'm confused. I don't want to mention names, but it's also the aggressiveness. So I've heard some people who really know about how the aggressiveness settings, and whether or not to a point to be aggressive enough to gradually get to the center line, or whether or not to get there as quickly as possible and continue to make corrections. And I've heard people say, people that know, I think, of course, you need to adjust your exposure to get a good exposure, but the time between those exposures, I've heard some people say let it go for a period of time. Of course, and I'm talking quality mounts here, and other people say, oh no, it's better to make corrections or make those adjustments in a shorter period, quicker, like every 2 seconds, as opposed to every 7 seconds. Take your image, your guide image. So
I think it goes back to the first tip that I started with is, if you can, go back and let your main camera image be the judge. If you're seeing it there, well, then maybe you need to adjust it. But if you're not seeing it,
Seeing what you-
if you're not seeing any, if you can, if your duration is 2 seconds or 3 seconds or 7 seconds, if you can get away with that and you're
Yeah.
not seeing in your main camera, then
Yeah.
you're good.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, that's kind of what I've settled in at. You kind of find an optimum spot,
Yeah.
where you feel comfortable and your graph seems to like kind of level out some, but overall you do a better job. Okay.
So I know I'm trying to keep this, I'm running kind of longer than I had planned here. So I'll try to run through these last few slides here and then we'll wrap up with any questions.
Okay.
We talked about writing obviously the calibration and guiding assistant. We've talked at that at length. It is okay to use PEC in the mount. The one suggestion though is that obviously if you're going to, put a PEC curve into the mount, use software for determining that and uploading it. PemPro is a very good one, so that you're getting a good PEC curve. We mentioned about guide rate already, and deck backlash lean towards the higher guide rate. The one thing that I didn't mention yet is in PhD. So other than guiding, it also there's a couple other tool wizards that are pretty cool that they've added some since I looked in there. So be sure to look under the tool menu in PhD2. One is a polar alignment wizard, which, we don't really do polar alignment all that often for those of us that have permanent observatories. But if you wanted to check it, you can, use that as one more way to do a polar alignment. And also check out the news section on the PhD2 website, because there's a lot of good information in there. I spent quite a bit of time in there just in preparing for this presentation. As far as myths, these are just some quick ones that I either ran across or I've heard just in my experience, and we've talked about a couple of them. It's a myth: guide camera and the main camera image scale have to be precisely matched. They both have to be 1 arc second per pixel or something like that. If I know there's been some discussion on that, it's not the case. In fact, all of these are false. We'll go through them. Understanding the image scale, obviously you want to, that's helpful in quantifying the guide performance in arc seconds. But as long as the guide camera is no more than, and this is just my recommendation, it's no more than 3 times the image scale of your main camera, you should be okay. Orienting the guide camera to align with the RI deck is required. We've already talked about that. It's not required, but it's a nice to have in terms of troubleshooting. Guide star focus and the shape of it needs to be perfectly round. So this is something that was a little surprising to me when I first started auto guiding. Is my guide stars are actually little footballs, and it's because I'm using off-axis guiding and I'm picking up the guide stars from the extreme outward parts of the light cone where my field flattener is not really doing a great job. But it doesn't matter, because PhD is still able to calculate a centroid on a football just as well as it is a sphere, and it didn't seem to matter for me. So for that reason, it doesn't have to be perfect in shape. And even if you're slightly out of focus, we've gotten away a lot. Now, I'll say that within reason. It needs to be a reasonable focus, but it doesn't need to be, tack sharp. And then the last one was a little surprising too, is that I know nobody's ever going to have perfect polar alignment. There's always going to be some level of error. But it was actually surprising that the creators of this, or the people that maintain it, actually said that some polar misalignment is actually helpful for some of the lower end mounts, because to avoid that backlash zone and or to avoid too many deck reversals or going through that, it actually is easier to guide or control. So that was something that was surprising to me too. But All right. So that was what I had to cover. There is still a ton of stuff. You can get so deep on this. And in fact, I pulled a lot of stuff. There's the guiding algorithms that PhD used, that you can even change those depending on your mount setup and stuff. There could be a whole nother talk on advanced auto guiding if there's a desire to do so. But I think if you follow the setup wizard and take the default settings, for the most of us, it's going to work just fine.
Hey, Jeff, I got a silly question. When you talk about, what do you mean by guide speed?
So in the setup wizard, when you, oh, now it's going to do that again to me, isn't it?
You're talking relative to sidereal rate, but I don't see the connection of giving the correction commands to the mount, how that is tied into the guides.
Well,
I guess I don't understand guide speed relative to tracking.
I think it's just a measure of, I guess I don't know. That's a good question. I can't answer it. I can show you where it asks and talks about that, but I'm not sure I understand the relationship myself.
Yeah. So, Gabe, you have any idea?
Not really. But from what I guess, if guide speed is 1x and you issue a command to go east, it would just stay frozen. It wouldn't move. That's what I would imagine. But
actually, maybe that is the connection, Gabe. Right? You know the guide pulses are issued for a period of time,
right?
But at what rate is it going to move the mount for that period of time?
Yeah,
that's probably where the connection is.
Okay.
So you can move it at half sidereal, full sidereal. Because if you move it too quick, you're going to get jerky movements, right?
Right.
And maybe that I always operate at half X is
right. I have too. I've never.
Huh. I think with AP mounts, they suggest always operating at 1x. I don't know. I've always just done 1x, so I don't know if that makes a difference if I were to go to half x.
It depends upon the mount. AP, like you said, 1x. Lost Mandy says half x for their mount, so I do think it's mount dependent.
Yeah.
Interesting.
All right. Any other questions? What is I have a question. What's the topic for the next imaging forum? I forgot. Is that Gabe, you again?
Yeah, I think it's me for electronics, which I think most of it will be on cameras and pixels and getting signal.
Right.
Okay.
One thing that I think is worth mentioning, which I kind of toyed around with the idea before I got my Mach 1, which is some mounts, they have a large deviation and in their periodic error. So if you have a very large periodic error, say 60 arc seconds over the cycle, if it's smooth, you can guide that out. And that's something to look into when you're doing the guiding graph, when you do the, I forget which portion in PhD it is, but when you check periodic error in the graph by turning off guiding and just looking at how the lines move, if it's nice and sinusoidal, just like a wave, that's great. But if you see very jerky movements and these very large deviations in of the star, that can be a problem. So those types of things, as Jeff mentioned, those high frequency changes are hard to guide out. But there are other options if you want to keep that mount, but add an accessory for adaptive optics. Those types of things are kind of shifts it a little bit into, instead of moving the mount all the time, you're moving this cover glass over in front of the sensor. And by tilting the cover glass by, a few degrees, it can effectively cancel out that drift. And because you're only tilting a cover glass, which is very small mass, you can do those update corrections very fast. So that's a possibility for if you do have a mount that you're having guiding issues with, you can add that. Of course, it's going to disrupt your imaging train. You'll have different spacings and all this fun stuff. But that is an option. And I think I suggested at one point to Paul that could be something for, I think, B-scope, because it does have these tracking errors, but it's a really nice scope for imaging, to where you could add that to that system. And you're not doing guiding on the mount per se anymore. You're just doing guiding using that optical element in between and doing the tilt to adjust the position of the star. And doing it that way, you could probably extend the exposure time by quite a bit beyond the 30 seconds that you would get.
And it's actually a good idea. It's just a device that you stick in the eyepiece, essentially, right? Would be.
Yeah, it would just go in front of your OAG and then connect to the telescope, and as the OAG, as the guide camera senses that the star is drifting, it issues the command instead of to the mount. It issues it to that
Right.
cover glass,
Right.
that will tilt and correct for it. And I think there's up to I don't know. There's some like limit to which it can correct for, because it can only tilt so far. And then traditionally what that would do is it would, once it gets out of sort of this boundary region, it would issue a large correction to the mount, and then the cover glass would return to zero and then start all over again. So
Is that
that's
kind of
another
like
option.
Adaptive optics, or I mean, is that?
They call it adaptive optics or active optics. It's not true adaptive optics. True adaptive optics is when you sort of calculate the wavefront and then you adjust the shape of your optics to accommodate that, and that's pretty, you can get insane resolution with that, because you use an artificial star, and then so world-class observatories do that. But this isn't that. It's just high frequency adjustment. Instead of the mount, it's adjusting the optical system to return it back to home. So that could be an option. I think those things run like $800 to $1,000 or something like that. But for a mount, instead of getting an astrophysics mount for $5,000, throwing that on your mount might be the solution. It's just another option.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have no experience with that, so that's interesting.
I did buy one, but I also shortly after that got my astrophysics mount, and then tried it on the astrophysics mount, and I was like, wow, this just it's not worth it. So I sold the adaptive optics thing. So it was kind of a fun experiment.
All right.
Good job, Jeff. Very nice.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, very good.
All right, thank you.